Something that Delany points out that is very important for us to keep in mind is that this conception of time as linear and progressive has actually been very influential in early anthropology. And in particular, she talks about evolutionism. And evolutionism is the idea that cultures and society evolve from, in quote, a more primitive state to, in quote, at a higher or more sophisticated level of civilization. So the idea that one society gives rise to the next one, so to speak, and that we progress in time towards the better, towards the more sophisticated, towards progress. Now, evolutionism has been completely discounted by anthropology since at least the middle of the last century, as they started to understand much better cultural diversity, and also they started to put in question the very idea of progress. And of course, also the ethnocentrism of this very thought, because European colonial societies were always put at the higher point of this evolutional ladder. And so they kind of represented the highest point of civilization, while everybody else was basically at lower level of civilization. So, of course, anthropology completely discounted that. But Delany mentions it, and I mention it here, because this idea of humanity has been quite widespread. And so occasionally we could still find it in circulation. And another thing Delany says that is very interesting is that this idea was also spatialized. So the people who were thought of being behind in time, or again in quote as primitive, or less civilized, again in quote, were also described as living on the periphery of the colonial world. So they were also imagined to be at the edges of space. This is also an interesting example of how time ideas and time conception actually sometimes work with space conception, and they strengthen each other. Once again, these are ideas that have been discounted in anthropology, but I want you to think in which other ways we can find these ideas around us still today. Now, we talked a little bit about different time conceptions, perhaps different ideas of thinking of calendars, different ideas of thinking the past and the future. Now, the question for us is also why thinking about time, why studying time, time concepts, and time reckoning like a calendar. And a first answer to that is that time, in a way, binds us to a community. So time is a relation with others and a relation with society. And perhaps the easiest example is work and time in our society. Very often, work is measured in time. And then again, you have a correlation between time and money. That is also a way in which our society is organized and how we coordinate our activities with society. We work 40 hours a week if we work full-time, or we work 20 hours a week if we work part-time. So already there you can see how this idea of time as quantifiable, as homogeneous, as a certain number of minutes and hours in a day already binds us to our society in a particular way. Another interesting example is the one of Benedict Anderson. He studied nationalism and he studied the nation state. And he said that the nation state is a particular idea, and it is an imagined community. And something he said is that that the way we imagine the nation state is actually premised upon a particular conception of time that arose historically, but was not always like that. And he described that, he says that we imagine the nation state as comprising of a community of individuals who each live a separate life, but so to speak, in parallel to each other. This is because they live on the same territory, so the same bounded nation, and at the same time. And sharing time and space then makes up a community that can be imagined as such, even if its members are actually never able to all meet face to face. So we think of ourselves as Canadian, even if we don't get to meet all Canadians face to face, because we imagine a community of Canadians who live in a certain place, Canada, and who live at the same time in parallel with each other. However, Anderson points out that it is only because we have this idea of time as external to people and as homogeneous, something that continues to progress no matter what we do, continues to flow no matter what we do, that makes possible this imagination of people who each live separate lives, but so to speak, at the same time. We said that time binds us to a community. A question that might be interesting to debate is how the pandemic actually changed our sense of time. By this I mean, how did it change the way we use time, perhaps, or organize our time, or talk about time, or even experience time? And one of the first, conversation I had at the beginning of the pandemic was actually with a friend of mine who had forwarded me a letter from another friend who was in Italy. And because my family is in Italy, my friends are in Italy, I also had a lot of conversation with people in Italy at the beginning of the pandemic. And something very interesting in relation to time is that people started to say to people somewhere else, so for example, to people in Canada, they started to say, look, we are our future. You are in our past. We are now living your future. They were saying 2 weeks ago, we also thought about the coronavirus like you. We also organized our lives like you did. But now we are your future. Now we are, for example, in lockdown. Now we understand things differently. Now we know that it is not just a flu and that we can go on having parties, for example, right? And that was just in March and April. But it was very interesting how they started to talk almost of time travel through the pandemic. So certain countries were in the future and certain countries were in the past, but they were, of course, all at the same time. There was almost this juncture or rupture in time. The other reason why we would want to research time and time concepts is because time is power. And let's go back for a moment to time in Simbo in Solomon Island, because it's a really clear example of this, right? So Burman explains that in Simbo, what is very interesting is that, first of all, the very calendar was, and he talks about Simbo in pre-colonial times, but I think so a long time ago, but I think it's still really valuable in terms of the link between time and power. And so what he said is that, first of all, the very calendar was controlled by calendar keepers that were from very influential families, and both had the calendar in their hands because they had power, and in turn, they had power because they controlled the calendar. And in fact, it went so far as to, there was this belief that the calendar keeper not only marked time on a specific calendar for all of them to see, but even were responsible for the changing of the season. So for the actual continuing of time through the season and through the different harvests of the different nuts. The other thing, though, that is very interesting is that this particular calendar, this alternating calendar, gave attention and gave prominence to events and aspects of life which related to men rather than to women. Because the alternating cycles of nuts and the alternating fishing from two different sides of the islands were men's activities. It was men who went and got these nuts from these trees. It was men who went fishing in boats and were thinking about the tide and thinking about the wind. Women, what they did was growing yams, which was much more on a cyclical conception of time than this alternating time. And also they dived for shellfish, which again was not so tied to different seasons, to different winds, and it was not so alternating. So already the calendar gave more attention to men's interests than women's interests. Another layer was added when the missionaries came in and they introduced the Gregorian calendar. When they did so, first of all, they displaced the power of the leaders and the families because now it was the church and the missionaries who actually, in a sense, held the calendar and had authority over the calendar. And the Gregorian calendar, of course, gave prominence to a week with 7 days and to Sundays with going to church and gave prominence to church events. So they became what more structures the life of the society and shifted power away from the traditional leaders and traditional the families that had this power in the first place to the missionaries and to the colonial and government officials. Another very kind of obvious example of how time and power go hand in hand is the calendar in the Trobriand island. Again, this is from older time, but it is another really interesting example of this, and it's described by Gell. And Gell describes that the Trobriander had a lunar calendar of approximately 12 months. There were adjustments to the months and to the length of months, but it was a calendar of 12 months with a new year, celebration in the 12 months. And what was particular about this calendar is that it was staggered by 1 month. So in Kitawa, the first month started earlier and started a month earlier than in Kubona, who was 1 month earlier, than in Kiriwina, who was 1 month earlier than in Vakuta. It is a bit like saying in Vancouver it is, and in the Lower Mainland it is January, but in Vancouver Island is actually February, and in Salt Spring Island is March, and in Bowen Island is April. Right, so really, but they had the same calendar. It started at different times. So, and Gell explains this peculiarity by saying that what happened is that because there was a yam exchange happening in the new year, this was a way of creating a maximum amount of yams available when the most important islands, the most powerful island where the most powerful people resided, had their yam exchange. And if I'm not mistaken, that is Kiriwina. So to speak, there was a cascading of amounts of yams that went along with the calendar and with this organization of months and their delays, so that the people who had most power in the Trobriand island and the island who had most power in this chain of islands also had the most yams available to do particularly large exchanges and celebrations. So very interesting way to organize a calendar, but very obvious how the calendar strengthened certain power relations and shaped the calendar to match it. So these examples are almost exaggerated example of how time and power go together. But Delany says that even when it's not so obvious, even when we don't have these calendars like the one I presented here, time is power. This is because ideas and practices of time usually work to translate cultural values, so wider values and ideas in society, into time framework and thus shape the lives of people. So we can say that ideas and practices of time are shaped by power relation and shape power relations. As Delany says, and this is a quote from her, calendars construct time in the same way that maps construct space, by embedding cultural schemas in the foundation of reality and vice versa. To say it in a simpler way, we can say that the way we measure time actually tells us what to pay attention to. Values and ideas in society become encapsulated, so to speak, in calendars and in ways of thinking and relating to time. And here, what is important is also that because we think of time as simply an objective aspect of our life, then we also take ideas of time for granted. And so we don't think of this link between time and power. And so we are usually not very critical of time as a particular social-cultural construction. And she discusses, and Delany discusses different calendars also as a subtle way of embedding values, things that we should pay attention to into the calendar and so in everyday life.